Hello and welcome to the Evolve Online School homeschooling series. What we hope to do in the next couple of months is provide our homeschooling families and community with information that is useful to them at making sure that they get the most out of their homeschool curriculum and also are able to tackle some of the common problems that are experienced by homeschooling parents and in the homeschool environments. I'm very excited to be joined today by Dr. Jim Stiles. Jim, I don't know if you would mind introducing yourself.
Sure, happy to. I have a lot of experience in South Africa. I met Colin when I was a professor at the School of Education at WITS, teaching education leadership, and we worked on a program for government and Catholic schools leaders that WITS was running at the time. So I have a long history with Colin and South Africa. Before I came to South Africa to teach, I was at Harvard for about 18 years, did my doctorate there, looking at, I have a quantitative background. So started out in finance, did my doctoral work, and then eventually became Associate Dean for degree programs at the School of Education. So while much of my work was in higher education, have a lot of knowledge about schools and schooling, both here in the US and in South Africa. But when I came back to the States, I built on some work I had been doing in South Africa with the foundation sector, those people who are trying to fund change from the outside. And I now work in the field of organizational learning with a relatively small consulting firm here that's called Fourth Quadrant Partners. And essentially, if I could boil it down to what work I do, we try to help teams learn how to get better results by careful attention to what they're doing. And how do you do that as a team and not as individuals on a team?
Thanks, Jim. Yeah, I think that I want to start there where you ended because, in previous conversations we've had, I find that part fascinating because it's about, we know that humans learn. It's kind of you learn because you're programmed to learn, and it's not something that you have to really actually even think about. You're learning whether you want to or not. But when you're working together in a group, then the dynamics are different. And if I've understood the work you've been doing correctly.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Humans are incredible at learning. And all of your parents already know this. They can think back to when their child was starting to walk. And, they were there trying to help them walk because who doesn't want to see their child walk first? So, they might hold them up with both hands and they let go and the child falls. And then next time they have the child hold on to a chair maybe, and then their hand, and then they let go of the hand and the child sort of balances for a while and maybe takes a step. What the child is doing is they're experimenting. They're experimenting with how do they place their weight? Where do they put their foot? How do they take that first step? How do they run to the other parent across the room who's holding out both hands? So we're good at learning as individuals. Learning to ride a bike, learning to be a really great football player. But when we start to work with others, that's where it gets more challenging. So at Fourth Quadrant Partners, what we do with organizations is we ask ourselves this question: what will it take for any group of people, any team, to learn as well together as any one of us can learn individually?
I think there's one more.
Essentially about making thinking visible.
Yeah, I want to come back to the making thinking visible part because I think that's interesting and it's got really practical application for a parent who's homeschooling. Wanted to just touch on something there. So I think what's interesting about what you say and what's relevant in my school and in this homeschooling space that we operate in is one of the common fears of a homeschooling parent is the lack of community, the lack of engagement with other children of the same age. And in one of our future webinars, we're actually going to talk to the strategies that Evolve Online is adopting to try and combat that sort of isolationism of homeschooling, that homeschooling kids experience. But if you can bake into your model a requirement of children learning together, and associate that with all the learning that you guys have done around what it takes for people to learn together, that's when things become better. And I think we all know that when you look at learning, and particularly groups learning, there's often, if things go right, there's the situation where the group can learn more as a group than what any individual could learn on their own, or that they spark learning in each other. So when one person knows something, they're able to pass that on, and the group, the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. But and I'm sure that's been your experience, but let me jump to that making learning visible part, because I think that has massive practical application in the homeschool space.
Yeah, and you might remember this whole concept of making thinking visible is not just what we do with emergent learning. It's something that in the school environment, 2 different research projects that grew out of Harvard that had practical applications in schools. We did some of that when I was in South Africa. Are essentially, how does a group of teachers, and I think you're doing this well at Evolve, how does that group of teachers use any particular set of data or a set of conversations to think not just about what the kids are learning, but what the kids learning tell them about the effectiveness of their teaching.
Yes.
Right. That notion of teaching and learning as a one-way conversation from teacher to student is what we try to disrupt with using feedback mechanisms that say, okay, this group of 25 students are getting this mark or these marks. What does that say about my effectiveness as a teacher? And you've used that data well to improve the teaching.
Yes.
I know.
Yes. I think, carry on. Sorry, I keep interrupting.
Yeah, let me just sort of follow it up with the making thinking visible. It's what we do for ourselves when we're learning how to walk. We're essentially that balancing and putting our weight and moving is making that visible to ourselves, but it's also we're getting positive reinforcement from our parents or the other caregivers. When we work in teams of individuals or in a school, when you're working, when the child is working either with their parents or their teacher, it's that making thinking visible becomes harder.
Yes.
Let me step back from that because I want to just do 2 things which are probably familiar to all your parents, but there are different kinds of knowledge. And 2 of the most prominent are things we call technical knowledge or adaptive knowledge.
Right.
So technical knowledge is pretty simple. 2 + 2 always equals 4, right?
Yes.
You have defined operators, and that's what we teach students.
Yes. Or if I turn this gear that way, that gear is going to turn that way, and it's going to be like that every time I turn the gear. There's no guesswork involved. Once I've figured the technicality out, as it were, it becomes a fixed point. Right.
But if you want to be Elon Musk and try to figure out how do I make an electric car, that takes there's a lot of technical knowledge in that. But there's also that adaptive change, I've got a new problem that no one has figured out before. And how do we do that together? Taking it back to the sports team, if someone wants to be a really good football player, well, there are technical things they need to learn.
Yes.
They need to learn how to kick and all that. But if a team wants to be a really great team, there's some technical things, skills, drills that you can do, but to be a really great team is something else. It's about how do you trust each other enough? How do you know someone else is there or will be there or has a better shot than you? that's the adaptive knowledge
Right,
it's harder to
right.
learn.
And each game, the answer is going to be different. Each game you
Exactly.
play, I mean, you've developed the trust that you know the other player will know from your movements where to position themselves. But that position's never going to be the same, and the particular pass you use may not be the same. It's interesting because when you look at the difference between basketball as a team sport and soccer as a team sport, basketball is a strongest link game. So often the outcome is determined by the strongest player you have. That Michael Jordan who can score from anywhere and can guarantee a certain number of points per game. And so if you the goal is to have as many of those superstars as possible, because that's what each individual, it's the individual performance that matters, not the team performance. Although there is team dynamics in basketball, it's much more determined by what that single superstar individual. And if you look at the winning basketball teams, they often have one iconic player who makes all the difference. Sometimes you find that in American football as well with the quarterback, for example. But yeah, I won't get on to Tom Brady. But on the other hand, soccer is a weakest link sport. The team is only as good as the weakest player. Because it doesn't matter how good your strikers are, it doesn't matter how good your backs are. If your linking player, if your midfielder is weak, you're never going to get a ball to that striker to score the goal. And you're never going to stop too many people passing the midfield and overwhelming the defense. And education, groups of teachers, for far too long have been seen as a strongest link game. It's about getting the best possible teacher and putting the best possible teacher in the class. And Fullen and Hargreaves did this amazing research on that book of theirs, Professional Capital, where they say the quality of a country's education can never exceed the quality of its teachers. And they also...
I was just going to say, you're absolutely right about what makes a great school. And in the homeschool environment, there's another significant component, which is what makes a great parent in a homeschool environment in
Correct.
support of what the teacher is doing.
Yes. Yes, I'm going to jump from that because I'm going to say it leads very easily to just putting on the table this idea that baby being allowed to fall. That baby, you don't see it as a problem when your child takes a step and then falls on their bottom. Okay, you encourage them and you say, "Well done, you at least made one step," and you pick them up. If they cry, you comfort them, but you don't do it in such a way that they become too scared. When they stand up again, you don't rush and hold them so that they don't fall again. You want them to fall safely. Okay, a soft place to fall is one of the most important things that a parent can offer a homeschooling child. And certainly, I think if I was to give advice to homeschooling parents about which curriculum to choose or which system of learning to choose for your child, if you choose to homeschool, one of the critical questions you should be asking about the service provider is how soft a place to fall that provider creates for children trying to learn in this homeschool environment. And I'm hoping we'll get onto this whole debate about the difference between marks and mastery if we have the time. So that ability to allow your child to fail is something that tends to fade over time. And the older a child gets in the schooling system, the less tolerance for failure exists in the system. And so that's an important point of what is it that a homeschooling parent can offer. It's that safe place to fall.
Yeah, it's that in the same way that when they're learning how to walk, it's how do we celebrate great experiments and attempts at learning that don't succeed. So if I'm when I'm working with teams in the real world, and I'm asking them to experiment because they're trying to improve their practice over time. They're trying to improve their results that they're getting from grant making for the foundation sector. They're trying to make, they're working on a really complex set of issues, like how do we decrease infant mortality, or how do we create a culture of health in a community. Nobody can give you the textbook answer, the technical solution to that. It's got to be adaptive. And the only way to really work in that space is to experiment. And so it's that soft place to land that you were just talking about. When knowledge is technical, if it's you're adding two numbers like 2 + 2, well, that's technical. There is an answer to that.
Correct.
But with problem-based learning, you're trying to do something much more complex.
Yes.
You're trying to
Yes.
say, there's a world out there. You're going to be part of that world, and there's not going to be any easy answers. So you need to figure out, how do I learn my way to the range of possible answers and then choose from them? And a lot of that has to do with the questions that you or someone else ask you.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, if I was to say to a homeschooling parent, just change one thing about how you talk to your child about their learning, it would be that point about questions. Before I move on to that, I just want to jump back to what you said about making thinking visible. From a practical perspective for a homeschooling parent, you can literally do that by thinking out loud. You know, one way you can do that is to say, okay, so I've got a problem here. If I put this thing here, I see this outcome. Now, maybe if I change this around. Now, when we're working at home, we tend to have those thoughts in our heads when the children are around us, and we're not actually modeling our thinking to them. Okay, and also what I would want my children to do, and again, if a parent wanted to support a child's learning, is to say, well, let me listen to your thinking. Take me through your thinking. Instead of just quietly doing that sum, speak out loud the steps that you're taking to answer this question. Or when you're writing your essay, you know, problematize it out loud, so that we can do that. But importantly, don't feel as a parent that you need, if you hear something that you think is wrong, or you hear something that is not what you think is a direction a child must go in, don't jump in and correct them. You know, let them go through that process. You know, keep a note of it, so that if things do go wrong, you've got some suggestions to make about how it could improve in the future. But let the child make that mistake, even though you can hear that mistake is coming. Let the child make the mistake, and then after the mistake is made, you're able to say, how interesting. Let's go through your thinking. Let's see, you know, where do you think things went awry? And that process of learning is so valuable for children. But
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And a very powerful modeling that any of us can do, whether it's for our employees or our colleagues or our children, is when we don't know the right answer, make that visible too.
Sure.
And then have a conversation about, well, what do you think I should do?
Sure.
What would you do if you were me?
Sure. Sure. Yeah, I agree. Then moving on to the other side of that, and that is to say, one of the things you explained in your analogy of a child learning to walk is you spoke about feedback, about the ability that children have to immediately know from their parents, you know, how they experience their child's learning to walk. It's one of the key weaknesses in most schools. I don't know if that's something that you experience in American schools, but one of the key weaknesses in the way school design works, or the way learning design works, is the gap between when a child does something and when they get feedback on what they've done, and the value that is placed on learning from that feedback. And in a traditional you know from your work in South Africa that, you know, we've had to move into a model of curriculum because of the complexity of our country, where to a large extent the what you teach each day, what you teach each term is scripted, and it's dictated to teachers that, you know, term 1, week 1, you're going to teach this to the kids, and then week 2 you're going to teach that to the kids. And what's not built into that system is any kind of analysis at the end of week 1 about how did that learning go. I mean, you referenced the fact that that's a strength of our system. How did that learning go? Did the kids actually learn the stuff? Which of the kids didn't? There's no time built in, there's no process built in to make that happen. It's simply a case of week one is now done, we're now going to start week two. And, we relentlessly work through the curriculum regardless of any data that might be building as to whether that works until they write a high stakes exam at the end of the year. And then you have your winners and your losers. Do you agree that that was your experience? And how do American schools overcome? Because I know the American system is very different from the South African system.
Well, there are many differences, and I would say there's a lot of variety as well. So the range of schooling in the U.S. is enormous, and the kinds of schools, and because there's no national curriculum, there's not even a state curriculum in many cases. It's very much at the local town level, and there's no such thing as an exit exam like you have with the matric. So well, let me introduce one other topic, one other term. Something we use in our work is called line of sight.
Yes.
And
yes.
that's what are you really trying to accomplish?
Yes.
Eventually. I mentioned, trying to decrease infant mortality. Group of healthcare professionals, community groups trying to do that in a particular area. Their line of sight is to decrease infant mortality. And they have a lot of steps along the way to do that. With schooling, in what I would term the best schools in America, their line of sight is to create independent thinkers who can critically analyze any piece of information or any question and come up with not necessarily the right answer, but a plausible and workable answer. So it's not about finding the correct essay to analyze a piece of literature that every other student in the country has read. It's that what are you trying to accomplish is what the line of sight for the better schools in America, I think, is trying to create that independent and self-assured individual who can analyze anything.
Go
ahead.
There's a Professor Feinstein. I can't remember off the top of my head which institution he's at, but he's a neuroscientist studying the sense of smell and how the sense of smell works neurochemically and within the brain. And he does a fantastic TED talk on the pursuit of ignorance. And in his talk, what he talks about is the purpose of study. So he criticizes the scientific method, where the scientific method starts off from a point of trying to complete a jigsaw puzzle or peel away the layers of an onion, because he argues that in both of those models there's a fundamental understanding that somehow knowledge is finite and there's a correct answer, and if you just provide the right experiment or do the right kind of process, you will arrive at the correct answer, and then you'll be able to use that answer to do things with. And he argues that the actual purpose of scientific endeavor is to find out what questions we should be asking. And how often it's repeated that by people in the science field, especially really, really phenomenally influential ones, that the more I learn, the less I know. So that's what he means by the pursuit of ignorance. The more you know you have to ask questions, the better your science. Now, related to what you're saying, it's not just about trying to come up with a plausible and practical answer to the problem, but it's knowing that your practical, plausible answer is not necessarily the only one. That somebody else with the same set of facts and the same problem to solve is perfectly capable of coming up with a completely different answer to that question, and both have equal value.
Exactly. And when you know that, it depends on what you're trying to do. If you're trying to do something very technical, and there's only one way to really do it, you don't need to think creatively.
No?
You just do it. That's what being on a factory production line was all about. You just do this thing in front of you, right? Well, in contemporary world, most of our problems, most of our work isn't so mechanistic.
Yes.
And so if we try to create students and working professionals who can ask really good questions and seek advice when they don't know something, or keep focused on what they're really trying to accomplish and not just the task that's right in front of them, that's what's
And
is going to make for a better and create
better
solutions
education. Yeah.
that are better.
Yeah. And if I draw that back to the homeschool environment, the advice to the homeschooling parent then is don't give your child the answer, okay, when they go wrong. Because, and we use this phrase, it comes from that method of the Harkness table method in Philip Exeter
Mm-hmm.
Academy in Boston. Well, not Boston, New England, but um, it's this three before me. Now, in that particular context, they mean if you answer a question, give three other people a chance to answer a question before you try and answer a question again, in order to make sure that everybody participates. So it's good in that context. But we've adapted that in our context, where if a child doesn't get to a level of mastery and they need to think about what they could do differently to get the points up, to get the mastery level up, they shouldn't just go straight to the parent or straight to the teacher and ask them for help. We want to build in our children this capacity to think about where else could I get the answer from, or how else could I try and solve this. And one of the goals of the Evolve Online model, and again, it's something I invite online parents to think very carefully about, or homeschooling parents to think very carefully about, is to what extent does the system that your child's school is following, or the curriculum that you've chosen for your child, develop independence of thinking and learning? To what extent
Mm-hmm.
does it build this agency in your child to take responsibility to find the answers more and more, and rely less and less on others giving them the answers? And so the
Mm-hmm.
three before me, what you have to do with a young child, or with any child in our system who's starting out in our system, is scaffold that a little bit. You need to say, well, what sort of things could you do? Could you go watch the video again? Could you try and do a few more sums? Could you ask a fellow student to help you with this? Before you go to an adult for an answer, what assets do you have to apply to the problem, to try and solve the problem independently? And that's something that's often missing in an education model, is that encouragement of independence in solving the problem, rather than, we give children homework to do, they come back to class, and we give them the answers. And then they look at where they went wrong. And in most schools in South Africa, that's where it ends. We give them the answers and we encourage them to look, but there's no follow-up, there's no process of following up, there's no mechanism that we teach them to scaffold that metacognitive thinking, that thinking about their thinking. And so, when you talk about that, it's a very practical thing to
Mm-hmm.
learn to hold of. One of our foundation phase experts, Jamie Lawrence, did a wonderful webinar. I think you'll find it on our YouTube channel, about helicopter parenting, and not give. She's talking particularly about grade 1, and you can imagine trying to remote teach a grade 1 to write and read is an interesting challenge, or interesting problem to solve. And I think our foundation phase have come up with the most brilliant solution to that. But one of the things Jamie is encountering is parents wanting to make sure that the children get the answers right, and giving the answers to their children. And because we're in a camera situation, we often can hear the parent giving the answer to the child while the lesson is ongoing. Interesting.
The power of technology.
The power of technology. Yeah. If I could,
Yeah.
no, carry on, Jim.
I was just going to say, that the parent who can ask, not give an answer, but ask an open-ended question that allows the student to find the answer themselves, is going to help their child so much more in the future.
Yeah. That leads me to this conversation about how should we measure learning.
Mm-hmm.
Because I know that in the work you're doing, often the question that gets asked is, how do we know whether we're succeeding And that's where your model of emergent learning and line of sight plays a particularly important role.
Mhm.
So, let me start with you and ask you, what is your answer to that question, or what is your experience in your work in that regard?
Well, it doesn't have a single answer because it would depend
No, of
on
course not.
what it is you're trying to teach and at what level. So if you're trying to teach a child how to read and asking them to puzzle through a more complex word, then obviously you can spell it out, you can sound it out, you can say, oh, is there any word in that word that you've seen before? You can ask a lot of those questions. When you're at a slightly higher level and your child is first confronting science experiments maybe say, I know one of the things that they have to do in, I forget what grade it is, 5, 6, they start to look at plant cycles and growing. Well, you can read about that in a book, but if you happen to have some outdoor space and you want to plant something, or technical knowledge is, in fifth grade, sixth grade, something like that, students have to start to learn how plants grow. What's the cycle of life there? And now they can learn a lot from whatever videos are there or what the teacher says, what they read. But if you have a little outdoor space and you can plant some seeds, get the soil tilled, put some fertilizer in, put the seed in, put the plant, water it periodically, and then the child sees it germinate and then grow into a plant. And maybe it's a vegetable, so they see the vegetable come forth. That's a much more powerful way to learn,
Correct.
and they'll never forget that.
Correct.
They might forget it if they only read it, but they never forget it if they actually do it.
Correct. I mean, wasn't it Skinner who said education is what we remember when we've forgotten everything we learned?
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Yeah, no,
yeah.
absolutely.
And I know particularly in the higher grades, you do a lot with problem-based learning.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So for example, we would use a model where we say to children, the problem is that we need you to colonize Mars. Um, we know that, and that's something I do want to point out. This isn't just like, let's throw learning at the children and see what happens. When we say, children will learn, I mean, we all know this, children will learn regardless. The reason you have a school, the reason you have a curriculum is to actually mold or model or shape what it is they're learning, because you have a belief that if you teach them certain things, it's going to prepare them for adult life. So there's a purpose behind schooling, which is not just a babysitting service. It's about molding children molding is the wrong word. It's about exposing children to learning that is going to be useful to them in later life. Too often, it's about teaching them stuff that they can return in an exam in order for me to measure their success, which is about as useless as a spare leg, to be honest. So that's the mold that we're trying to break. That's the disruption that we're bringing to the South African education system, is to use an approach that says it's the learning that matters, not the marks. I don't want to measure a child's performance based on marks.
Well, that's similar to what we're doing with adults around foundations and nonprofit work. It's not just, did they hold the meeting? Did they give out the grants? Did the people try to do something? It's, what did they learn in that process about holding a meeting, about giving a grant? What are the results better when they're trying something new? So thinking about that problem you just identified of, a higher grade, the problem is, how do they establish a colony on Mars? Okay, there's a lot of technical knowledge that they've learned earlier. I just mentioned the plant cycle. So a teacher, a parent could say, well, what are they going to eat when they get there? And the kid says, I don't, maybe they go to the spar. Hopefully they won't say that. But they would, then the parents say, remember when you did that plant cycle when we planted those millies?
Yes. Yes.
Oh yeah, I remember that. And then they say, okay, I'm just going to grow millies. And then the parent can say, oh, sure, well, we could try that here. I could serve you millies every day and only millies.
For the next month, yes. Yes.
So it's about going along with them and not, the answer is not that they need to diversify their food sources, but you don't want to say that. You want them to say, oh yeah, well, no, I don't want to eat just millies, etc. That's the power of problem-based learning, because then the student starts to make the connections. They do that integrative thought and integrative thinking that's going to serve them the rest of their lives.
Correct. It's that discovering the answer as opposed to being given the answer. And so we can use a project like Colonizing Mars, and back to what I said about, we're deliberate about what we want children to learn. So we use a curriculum map that our learning architects have developed for us, which says at this level, for this learning area, these are the things children should now be able to do. And I just want to emphasize that phrase. It's a very important phrase in our model. What should a child know, which is the technical kind of stuff, or be able to do, which is the more skills-based kind of stuff. Okay, and we're trying to answer that question all the time in every lesson, in every learning exercise. We actually start from that point. By the time, a teacher can't teach something without being able to answer the question. At the end of my teaching this, the children should know or be able to do the following. It's actually scary how rare that thinking is in education in South Africa. It's scary how little thought is given by teachers to that particular concept. The assumption is the people who developed the curriculum have thought about that, so I don't have to think about
it. And here's another problem. Sometimes the people with all good intentions who develop that curriculum in traditional schools haven't ever taught fourth grade. And so they don't have that understanding of fourth graders and what they're actually able to do. And I'll give you one small example. I looked at the curriculum for fourth graders in detail in South Africa one year. It may have changed, and I'm not casting aspersions, but they had the idea of teaching writing by looking at different genres, different ways of presenting written word. So whether it's a biography or a newspaper article, great. That's a great way to teach writing. But trying to teach 52 different genres to fourth graders, including how do you write a CV, which was in the curriculum for fourth grade, probably means they haven't really thought about what a fourth grader is capable of doing, or what have we scaffolded them in third grade in order to get them to ability to write different genres in fourth grade. So that's kind of what I mean. And it sounds like that's what you at Evolve are really trying to focus on. If we want them to be able to discover how do you colonize Mars by grade 9, what do we do in grade 4, in grade 5, in grade 6, so that they have the range and skill set to do that work?
Correct. So each year is the curriculum is the spiral process of saying we want to teach this here because it gives us the ability to teach that later on, and that's exactly what our curriculum map's done. And one of the definitions of disruption talks about, or the original definition of disruption talks about the fact that disruption in itself is not necessarily innovative. A good disruptive output actually builds on tried and tested methodologies and processes that, it just puts them together in a novel way. The innovation lies in how you bring these different elements together, which is a wonderful description of what Evolve Online curriculum is all about. Mastery-based learning dates back to the Middle Ages, when you did an apprenticeship with a blacksmith and using a flipped classroom model is something that goes all the way back. And, so all the elements, and one of the giants whose shoulders we're standing on is actually quite close to where you live and where you're talking from right now, which is the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. The MIT Aeronautical Engineering faculty came up with this model called Crosslinks, where they looked at a different way to build their curriculum to ensure a proper flow of learning for their children and mastery of the learning. And that's where you say, I'm trying to teach this. This is the thing a child should now be able to do. But I've thought about what should they already know in order to know this. I thought about what's related to this to deepen their knowledge. And I've thought about where would they be able to go after this. And then I start to ask the question, well, how do I teach them this? How do they practice it? And how do I test their mastery? So I think you're right. That whole problem of how do I colonize Mars opens the doors for us to tick boxes in the physics and learning about momentum and conservation of energy, ticks boxes on the plant cycle and nutrition and all these things that are in the curriculum that are generally just given to the children to learn rather than given to the children in a way that allows them to discover that
information. I think for me, the really exciting thing is not just what's happening for the child there. It's what could happen in the conversation between the parent and the child. Because in a problem-based learning environment, the parent gets to be on the journey, and they get to say, just like they did when they held their child's hand walking, and they said, "Try this, do this." They can say, "Well, if the child presents a very abstract problem, like we're going to colonize Mars, well, that's a big problem," and you could ask, "Well, what will it take to do that?" Or if you're trying to help them make a connection, which when they know something from doing a math problem or a science problem, or maybe it's about government and how does a society get organized, you can ask them, "Well, where have you seen that before?" Or what do we know about organizing groups of people? Or you can ask those kinds of really open-ended questions, and you can get your child to make their thinking visible for you. And that's much richer than just saying, "I got the right answer and good job." You get to have a conversation about it.
In the model that we have and in the approach to delivery of curriculum that we've adopted, one of the features that I really celebrate is the fact that the parent is included. I describe our class to our teachers, our activators, as we call them, as you must imagine this class to be a classroom where all the children are sitting in the front and all the parents are sitting at the back. It's a completely transparent classroom. It's not like I drop my kid off at school in the morning, I pick my kid up at school in the afternoon, and what happened in between is this black box. I can ask questions about, how was your day, and the answer is fine. What did you learn? Nothing. There's a lack of transparency, or there's a lack of access really for a parent in what's going on in their child's daily learning in that environment. And it's often one of the reasons why parents choose to homeschool. But within the homeschooling sector in South Africa, there's a really wide range of approaches to curriculum delivery. And the most common one is to just give parents curriculum and say, go for it, you're on your own, send the tests that your child writes to us and we'll mark them for you. That's what you get from us. Here are some recorded lessons for your child to watch. They're the exercises they must do. Send the tests and we'll mark them for you. I'm not seeing a lot of movement away from the send the test and we'll mark it for you model and this regime of marks and dictating the type of measures of marks. What I like about what we're doing, one of the many things I like about what we're doing is this, with our live reporting of what children are doing, with our access to the teachers that, literally with our model, and this has happened, a child can log on to MS Teams and call me as the principal, or send me a message. And, it's not intrusive. It's like this continuously open door, but I get to decide when to engage with it. So it's not intrusive, but at the same time, it is a unfettered access to whoever you want to connect with within the network. And we're trying to build a system to make that possible for our parents as well. And what a parent can do with that. So if I give you an example of one of our parents in Cape Town, she noticed that one of her children, she's got 2 boys with us, and one of her boys was learning about bridges and structures of bridges and how bridges are built to carry different weights and the engineering of that. And so she took the 2 boys, she put them in the car, she took them on a drive around Cape Town, visiting different bridges in Cape Town and having them describe to her what they'd been learning and how that matched what they were seeing on the ground. I mean, that same period when the children were learning about plants and the plant cycle, etc., took the kids to Kirstenbosch, to the gardens there, and did the kids were having the lessons. One of the most fun things about our model is it doesn't matter where you are in the world, you can still have your lesson. And these kids were literally having their lesson about plants in a national botanical garden, and could close down the computer when the lesson ended and then go for a walk and try and find examples. Now, obviously, that parent has the time, and most of our parents will not have the time, but that doesn't mean to say you can't make the time in the weekend or whatever, and having that direct interest. So there's those 2 things. It's that safe landing, and it's that engagement and asking questions and being interested. You know, you are so focused when your child is learning to walk. Your child has your full attention. You're not distracted. You're not going to, while your child is taking their first steps, that's not when you're going to pull out your phone and start writing an SMS. Well, you might pull out your phone these days and film your child walking so that you can post it on social media. But nonetheless, you know, I would discourage that. I would say throw the phone away and just concentrate. So I would ask all our homeschooling parents 2 things. Check what model of learning, check how this particular service provider that you're choosing to deliver the education to your child goes about structuring that learning, goes about what is their theory of action, what do they think learning looks like. And when you're inquiring, if you're still thinking about going into homeschooling, that's one of the key questions you should ask. How do you think learning works? I mean, I'd love to hear the answers. If you phoned up 3 different home schools and schooling curriculum providers and you said to them, can you just first explain to me how you think children learn? I wonder how many of them would be able to answer that question. In any clear, understandable way. We've run out of time, Jim. It's been such a privilege and a pleasure to talk to you. I know from our past experience we could go on for 3 hours and that would be fun.
Yes, indeed.
But I know you're in Boston at the moment. I keep interrupting you. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, you know, as you know, I will be in South Africa at the end of this month, so we will certainly continue this one-on-one with you, and maybe we can talk with some of your teachers and parents as well.
I would love that. I'd love to set up an opportunity for my parents to engage with you. It's spring in Boston. You guys are starting to see the flowers come out, yes?
Well, it's supposed to be spring, but we had snow on the ground on Tuesday, which was a little surprising. But
climate change strikes again. I remember being in Boston for that one course I attended at the graduate school where it was, I think it was in April, and there was snow. You know, so it's still possible all the way through this month for you to experience that. I remember my daughter who was with me. She was 13 at the time. We got lost trying to find Whole Foods. But Jim, you know, I'm just so grateful for your time and your expertise and the opportunity to talk to you in this way. So thank you. I really look forward to when you're here. We're going to have a great chat then as well.
Terrific. Always a pleasure, Colin, and really excited to see how the school continues to grow and change and help this vital sector of South African education to meet more complex goals.
Agreed. All right. Stay well.
Take care.
Thank you so much. Keep well. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Cheerio, peeps.